The marble halls of Congress echoed with whispers that no one wanted to say out loud. Behind closed doors, Democratic leadership had just delivered the most humiliating blow possible to one of their own rising stars, Jasmine Crockett, the fundraising powerhouse who had raised over $4 million for the party, the tireless campaigner who had attended over 100 events. The loyal soldier who had given everything had just been placed dead last in the leadership vote. But what the Democratic establishment didn't realize was that their brutal rejection had just created their worst possible enemy. The revenge plan that Jasmine Crockett was about to unleash would shake the very foundations of the party and expose the ugly truth about how they really treat their most dedicated members. If you think political betrayal stories always end with the victim quietly walking away, you're about to witness something that will change everything. Hit that subscribe button, because what Jasmine Crockett is planning will send shockwaves through the entire Democratic Party, and they have no idea what's coming. The rejection hadn't just been a simple no, or even a polite, maybe next time. It had been a calculated, systematic humiliation designed to send a message not just to Jasmine Crockett, but to anyone else who might dare to challenge the established order. When the preliminary caucus votes were tallied for the House Committee on Oversight and Government Reform ranking member position, Crockett hadn't come in second or third or even a respectable fourth. She had come in dead last. Dead last. For a woman who had poured her heart, soul, and treasure into the Democratic Party, who had been the ultimate team player even when it meant sacrificing her own political brand for the collective good, the message was crystal clear: your loyalty means nothing. Your fundraising means nothing. Your hard work means nothing. You will always be expendable. But the party leaders who orchestrated this humiliation had made one critical miscalculation. They had mistaken Jasmine Crockett's team loyalty for weakness, her collaborative spirit for submission, her dedication for desperation. What they were about to discover was that they had just betrayed someone with the legal mind of a constitutional attorney, the strategic thinking of a master politician, and the righteous anger of a woman who had finally seen the system for what it really was. The whispers had started immediately after the vote. "She's not a team player," they said. "She's too independent," others murmured. "She doesn't understand how things work around here." The establishment veterans concluded with the kind of patronizing dismissal that had become their default response to anyone who threatened their comfortable hierarchy. What made the rejection even more insulting was the paper trail of Crockett's loyalty that anyone could easily verify. $4 million raised for the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. Over 100 campaign events attended as a party surrogate. Countless hours spent building coalitions, mentoring newer members, and advancing the party's legislative agenda. Her voting record was as solid blue as they came. Her messaging discipline was exemplary, and her ability to articulate progressive values to diverse audiences was unmatched. But none of that mattered when the votes were counted in that closed-door caucus meeting. The fix, as they say, had been in from the beginning. The official explanation would be couched in the usual political doublespeak about experience and seniority and institutional knowledge. But the real reasons were being whispered in corners where they thought Crockett couldn't hear. She was too young, too outspoken, too willing to call out hypocrisy, even when it came from within her own party. She had committed the ultimate sin in Democratic Party politics. She had built an independent power base that didn't depend entirely on their approval. As Crockett sat in her congressional office the night after the humiliating vote, surrounded by the thank you notes from grateful constituents and the awards from civil rights organizations, a plan began to form in her mind. If the Democratic Party wanted to treat her as expendable, she would show them exactly what they were about to lose. The first phase of her revenge was already in motion, though the party leadership was too arrogant to recognize it. While they were congratulating themselves on keeping the uppity congresswoman in her place, Crockett was quietly making phone calls that would change everything. "I'm seriously weighing it," she had told the interviewer when asked about a potential Senate run, her voice carrying a calm determination that should have been a warning to anyone paying attention. "I'm about to spend a lot of money to get data." That data wasn't just about voter preferences or fundraising potential. It was about something far more dangerous to the Democratic establishment. Proof that their carefully constructed coalition was built on a foundation of lies, exclusion, and the systematic marginalization of the very people who did the heaviest lifting for the party. Texas was about to undergo redistricting that would eliminate Crockett's current House district. forcing her into a difficult decision about her political future. The Democratic leadership had probably been counting on this complication to push her into early retirement, or at least to force her to spend her energy fighting for political survival rather than building influence within the party. Instead, they had inadvertently given her the perfect opportunity to blow up their entire Texas operation. A Senate run would mean more than just challenging the Republican incumbent. It would mean building a statewide organization that could compete with the existing Democratic Party infrastructure. It would mean raising tens of millions of dollars from donors who were increasingly frustrated with the party's inability to win in red states. Most importantly, it would mean telling a story about Democratic Party dysfunction that would resonate with voters who had been wondering why their party seemed so much better at fighting each other than fighting Republicans. But the Senate campaign was just the beginning of what Crockett was planning. The real nightmare for Democratic leadership wouldn't come from her winning or losing a Senate race. It would come from what she planned to reveal during that campaign about how the party really operates behind the scenes. The conversation she had recorded with permission during the leadership fight would form the backbone of a tell-all narrative that would expose the ugly reality of Democratic Party politics. The promises made and broken, the deals cut in smoky back rooms, the systematic exclusion of women and minorities from real power despite their public rhetoric about diversity and inclusion. There's absolutely a frustration as a Black woman in America in general. She had told reporters after the leadership vote, but that was just the public version of her feelings. The private version was far more damaging to the party that had just rejected her. Behind closed doors, she had been subjected to a level of scrutiny and skepticism that her white male colleagues never faced. Her fundraising success had been dismissed as flashy rather than substantive. Her media appearances had been criticized as too aggressive rather than effective. Her policy positions had been questioned not on their merits, but on whether they were politically viable in ways that revealed the deep-seated assumptions about what kinds of messengers could effectively deliver what kinds of messages. The data she was about to commission would tell a story that the Democratic Party desperately didn't want told. Despite decades of rhetoric about being the party of inclusion and diversity, their actual power structure remained dominated by the same narrow slice of the political class that had controlled it for generations. More damaging still would be the financial analysis that would accompany her Senate campaign. When voters learned that she had raised $4 million for other Democratic candidates while being told she wasn't ready for leadership, the obvious questions would emerge. Who was getting that money instead, and what had they done to earn it? The answers to those questions would reveal a patronage system that rewarded loyalty to leadership over effectiveness, connections over competence, and conformity over innovation. The very system that had just rejected her would be exposed as fundamentally corrupt and self-serving. But perhaps the most devastating element of Crockett's emerging revenge plan was the coalition she was quietly building with other Democrats who had been similarly marginalized by the party establishment. Women who had been passed over for leadership positions despite superior qualifications. Minorities who had been told to wait their turn while less accomplished white colleagues were fast-tracked to positions of influence. Progressives who had been lectured about the need for moderation while moderate Democrats lost election after election. These weren't random malcontents or troublemakers. They were some of the party's most effective fundraisers, most compelling speakers, and most innovative policy thinkers. They were exactly the people the party needed to energize its base and expand its appeal. But they had been systematically excluded from real power by a leadership structure that prioritized comfort over competence. The beauty of Crockett's plan was that it didn't require her to leave the Democratic Party or to become a spoiler in the traditional sense. Instead, she would use the party's own rhetoric about democracy, inclusion, and fighting for the underdog against the party establishment itself. When she announced her Senate campaign, it wouldn't be as just another Democratic candidate seeking to flip a red seat. It would be as a reform candidate seeking to fundamentally change how the Democratic Party operates, starting with Texas and expanding nationwide. The message would be simple and devastating. The Democratic Party talks about fighting for working families while systematically excluding working-class voices from leadership. They talk about racial justice while maintaining a power structure that relegates their most effective Black leaders to fundraising roles rather than decision-making positions. They talk about women's equality while subjecting their female members to standards of scrutiny and criticism that their male colleagues never face. This wouldn't be a campaign about policy differences or ideological disputes. It would be a campaign about power, about who gets to wield it, and about how the Democratic Party's internal culture had become a barrier to achieving its stated goals. The preliminary conversations with potential campaign staff weren't just about building a traditional Senate campaign organization. They were about building something that could eventually challenge Democratic incumbents across the country who had become too comfortable in their positions and too disconnected from the energy and innovation that the party desperately needed. "We've talked to, there's only one person that I can see leading this team," Crockett had said in the interview, her careful choice of words revealing more than she was saying directly. "Somebody that I've known for years, somebody that I trust, and somebody who's very experienced." That person wasn't just an experienced campaign manager. They were someone with deep connections throughout the progressive political ecosystem. Someone who understood how to build grassroots movements that could challenge entrenched power structures. Someone who had been waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity to reshape Democratic politics from the ground up. The face-to-face meeting she had referenced wasn't just about campaign strategy. It was about coordinating a multi-state effort that would use her Senate campaign as a launching pad for something much bigger, a systematic challenge to Democratic incumbents who had prioritized their own comfort over their party's success. The beauty of the plan was its simplicity. Rather than trying to build a third party or split the Democratic coalition, Crockett would use the party's own primary system against them. In state after state, district after district, candidates aligned with her vision of what the Democratic Party could become would challenge incumbents who represented what the party had become. The funding for this operation wouldn't come from the traditional Democratic donor class, many of whom were perfectly happy with the current arrangement that gave them access and influence in exchange for their contributions. Instead, it would come from the millions of small-dollar donors who had been energized by candidates like Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but had become disillusioned with a party that seemed more interested in managing their expectations than delivering on their hopes. The data operation she was funding wouldn't just be about Texas voter preferences. It would be about identifying districts across the country where progressive primary challengers could successfully take on Democratic incumbents who had become too comfortable and too complacent. More importantly, it would be about identifying the financial and organizational weaknesses of those incumbents, many of whom hadn't faced serious primary challenges in decades and had grown lazy about maintaining their political operations. The research would also focus on the voting records and public statements of Democratic incumbents, looking for patterns of hypocrisy and contradiction that could be used against them in primary campaigns. Members who talked about fighting for working families while accepting donations from corporate interests that opposed pro-worker legislation. Members who spoke eloquently about racial justice while supporting policies that maintained racial inequality. Members who claimed to support women's rights while participating in the systematic exclusion of women from party leadership. But perhaps most devastatingly, the research would focus on the leadership votes and internal party decisions that revealed how Democratic incumbents really operated when they thought no one was watching. The same closed-door processes that had been used to humiliate Crockett would become weapons against the very people who had participated in them. The timeline for this operation was already in motion, synchronized with the electoral calendar in ways that would maximize its impact. The Senate announcement would come first, generating national attention and establishing Crockett as a leader of Democratic Party reform. The research and candidate recruitment would happen during the Senate campaign, building toward a wave of primary challenges in the following election cycle. By the time Democratic leadership realized what was happening, it would be too late to stop it. They would be facing coordinated primary challenges in dozens of districts simultaneously, funded by a donor network they couldn't control and organized by operatives they couldn't intimidate. The message discipline would be ruthless and consistent. The Democratic Party had become too comfortable with failure, too accepting of defeat, and too disconnected from the people it claimed to represent. Real change required new leadership that understood how to fight and win, rather than just how to manage decline. The beauty of this strategy was that it used the Democratic Party's own rhetoric against them. Every speech about fighting for the underdog, every press release about standing up to powerful interests, every fundraising email about the need for change would become evidence of their hypocrisy when they found themselves on the receiving end of exactly the kind of challenges they claimed to support. The psychological impact on Democratic incumbents would be devastating. Many of them had never faced serious opposition from within their own party and had no idea how to respond to criticisms that came from the left rather than the right. They would be forced to defend records that they had never expected to be scrutinized by their own voters. More importantly, they would be forced to explain why they had voted to maintain a party power structure that excluded the very people whose energy and innovation the party desperately needed. The leadership vote that had humiliated Crockett would become a central issue in dozens of primary campaigns across the country. As Crockett sat in her office that night, reviewing the preliminary data from her research operation, she couldn't help but smile at the irony. The Democratic Party leadership had thought they were teaching her a lesson about knowing her place. Instead, they had provided her with the motivation and the moral authority to teach them a lesson about the consequences of taking their most dedicated members for granted. The nightmare they had created for themselves was just beginning, and they had no one to blame but themselves. Sometimes the most dangerous enemy is the one you create through your own arrogance and short-sightedness. The woman they had rejected as not a team player was about to show them what a real team looked like, and they weren't going to be on it. When the dust settled from what was coming, the Democratic Party would either be fundamentally transformed or fundamentally destroyed. Either outcome would be better than the comfortable mediocrity that had led to decades of preventable defeats and missed opportunities. Jasmine Crockett had given them every opportunity to include her in their vision of the party's future. Since they had chosen to exclude her, she would build her own vision, and she would use their own weapons against them to make it a reality. The revolution was about to begin, and the very people who had made it necessary would be its first casualties. The data would be ready in 3 weeks. The campaign announcement would come a month after that. The primary challenges would launch 6 months later. By the time the Democratic establishment realized what was happening, Jasmine Crockett would already be winning. The woman they had humiliated was about to become their worst nightmare, and she was going to enjoy every minute of it. Sometimes revenge isn't about getting even. Sometimes it's about getting better, and sometimes it's about making sure that the people who wronged you never have the power to wrong anyone else again. Jasmine Crockett was about to accomplish all three. If this deep dive into political revenge and party transformation inspired you, don't forget to like and subscribe for more exclusive content about the power struggles happening behind the scenes in American politics. What do you think about Crockett's strategy? Is this the kind of change the Democratic Party needs, or will it tear the party apart? Let us know in the comments below.